Welcome, one and all, back to Form Check Friday. We're here to take a look at lifting videos that you have submitted, and we're gonna give you my best technique advice. Been coaching powerlifting for a little over a decade, rather successfully, I might add, and I'm gonna do my best for our community to give some good, solid advice. If you're interested in submitting, there is a link in the description box below that tells you everything you need to know for how to send us a video. And as a reminder, always more context is better, because then Dylan has to read more stuff.
I break it down a little bit, but
I'll break it down.
Sometimes I get lazy and I will just put the full email. So
all right, Dill, break it down.
All right, so last week we left off with Andrew McFetridge. I also decided that I'll probably just use first names because then I don't have to read as many names. So this is Andrew, 220 for 1 kilo. He went from 243 pounds to 188 pounds in body weight.
It's on loop.
Doesn't have a coach, so form can be dodgy. This was 10 days out from a comp. His low back feels tight/sore after deadlifting.
All right, so first off, we've got a pretty tall lifter here. And anytime we've got a tall lifter, you know, there's a bit of a disadvantage to tall lifters having to lift on the same size equipment as everybody else, right? And Dylan is a victim of this too at just 6 feet even. You know, Dylan having to fit basically all of his length of limbs in on a standard bar. Now Dylan pulls sumo, so it's a little bit different, but I think we're running into some of the same issues, right? With this relatively narrow stance and relatively narrow grip, we're seeing the knees crowded inwards, right? And when we get that sort of internal rotation at the hip, when we see the knee come in.
Quiet on set.
Thank you for the contribution, Bronson.
Oh my God.
Hey, Brownie, come here. All right, so when we get this sort of internal rotation at the hip of the upper limb of the leg, what happens is we lose a lot of the ability to kind of like orient and produce force from the low back and hips in a way that the low back and hips generally want to, and that is with a, you know, relatively neutral low back and our extension power kind of coming from the hips. What happens here instead is with that little kind of like knee in angle, what happens is we're not getting a whole lot of the hips. We end up rounding out the back pretty substantially, and then we get to the lockout and it's relatively smooth because we're conventional. I think if this were a sumo and we had lost as much positioning, it might be a bit more of a fight. But I also think when we get to a competition, we're probably gonna miss somewhere between like here and lockout, because our back is having to do a lot of that extension, right? We're having to get a lot of that extension from the erectors, from the spinal erectors. And you can also see this slight tendency here to want to wedge your knees under the bar there to try to get more upright, right? You're just doing anything you can to pull back and get extended. So what's my recommendation? Number one, that you grip a little wider. I think potentially even narrowing the stance, because where we anchor through the foot is going to dictate the orientation of the lower limb of the leg, your tib fib here. And if you can get the feet, a little narrower, a lot of times we're going to be able to kind of get some of that external rotation at the hip, right? We're going to be able to get those knees out and a little more in line and make room for your torso and your quad, right? Those two structures right now are kind of running into one another, and it's gonna make it really, really hard to get a neutral back position. Now, the next thing that I want you to think about when you're lifting is this setup. We get into a really sort of squatty position, right? You really wedge the knees forward, and I think probably a slightly higher hip position in combination with a wider grip allowing you to get that, I keep saying it, external rotation at the hip, is gonna allow you to get a much better back position. And it's going to be able to, you're going to be able to maintain a lot better position throughout the lift. You're going to be able to get a lot more power from your quads, hamstrings, and hips, as opposed to getting here where, you know, our hips are close-ish to extension, our knees are close-ish to extension, but we got a lot of range of motion to go, and that's all coming from back extension. So those would be my main pieces of advice, and I hope that helps for you, Andrew.
Okay, next up. What?
Nothing, man. Nothing.
Next up.
You're doing great. Keep it up.
I'm just trying to keep this train rolling.
Yeah.
Next
keep the
up,
flow.
we got Charlie.
Charlie.
This is a squat.
All right.
220 kilos for 10, RPE 7, but then in brackets he says 10 by the end. So I'm not really sure.
Ah, the old 7 with a misgroove. Either that or we're attributing RPE to the first rep and then differently to the next reps.
He gets a rather sharp sciatic pain whenever he goes above an RPE 8, and when it has been that way for years, Charlie is wondering if he is squatting for the wrong body type. The video submission was after a PR at a heavier weight, so he is already quite fatigued, but is pretty sure it's accurate to how he always squats.
All right. So I want to see this last rep here. So it was a 7, but it was also a 10. I don't know if we're doing like an AMRAP or something like this. Looks like we got a little out of position, off balance on that last rep there. And yeah, we had to fight for that one.
Looks like he's wearing some kind of like brief.
Yeah, I think he's wearing like a light compression pant kind of thing. You see it in strongman relatively often. So yeah, I mean, this is obviously a very high RPE set. Like I would say this looks to me like you're doing an AMRAP, which may or may not be accurate. The big thing I'm seeing here is, number one, we have a real sort of, we have a hesitation when it comes to getting depth. And we also are not really bracing or initiating the lift the way I would try to coach a lift or two. So you can see here, this is a very classic sort of Olympic lifting or high bar looking squat, right? You're trying very hard to stay upright. We see as soon as you hinge at the hips, we see this really exaggerated extension here. And I say hinge at the hips, but we don't really hinge at the hips, right? You just push your knees forward and extend, and then we're running into not really getting depth because we're trying to stay so upright and because we're really only focusing on breaking at the knees. So I think the thing here is we need to learn how to hinge. We need to learn how to incorporate your posterior chain into the lift and how to brace better. So let's break those things down. Now, when we're talking about hinging, essentially we want to allow this torso to change position instead of driving the chest up so hard. That's a really common cue. You've probably heard me talk about how it's not very useful many, many times before, but you're really trying to stay very upright and it's causing this sort of excessive extension, which is also causing us to lose a lot of control into the bottom, right? If we look at these later reps, we're not really sure where we are. Depth is inconsistent. We're hitting the bottom position differently in a lot of these reps. And, you know, I don't think that we're adequately producing or transferring force from the lower body through up into the bar. So what I would say is, like, strip this way down, get that bar a little lower, right? And let's try to learn some low bar squatting. Now, is low bar the thing that's gonna fix everything or make you feel better? Maybe, who knows? But I think the additional sort of stimulus of having that bar lower on your back is gonna encourage you to squat in a way that's gonna help us get around some of these tendencies. And the tendency being, again, you know, a lot of extension here. So I think we could do a fair bit of bracing at work in terms of learning to keep our ribs down in the front and maintain a more neutral angle. And then when you initiate the squat, I want you to actively let your torso tilt, right? We don't necessarily want this change in position this way. We want this to go into this. So we're seeing that same sort of rigid and stacked structure hinge. And that hinge is happening at the hips, right? So one of my favorite ways to practice the hip hinge is to get a broomstick or a dowel and put one hand behind below, one hand behind in front, and try to get 3 points of contact from that dowel to your back. So the 3 points are gonna be pretty much right at your butt crack, your upper back, and your head. And then you're gonna hinge. You're gonna hinge at the hips, and you're gonna try to keep all 3 of those points of contact in contact while you initiate the squat. Now, when you get to the bottom of the squat, yeah, you know, you might see a little bit of movement in that low back, that's fine. But to initiate the squat, if you're doing the squat the way that we're seeing it here, and we're going into that overextension, you're gonna feel that sort of mid back come off the dowel, which means we've gone into overextension. We're no longer hinging as much as we are just kind of extending and trying to like really reach up. Now, this also tends to be a little bit, you know, if we're putting all that extra kind of extension, extra stress, I could see that. What's up?
Like this?
Yeah.
I don't know if the camera can see me. And then squat?
Yeah.
I can't squat fast right now.
But even just the initiation of the lift there, right? Like, so the first third of the lift, being able to maintain your back and usually your head, right?
Oh yeah, this is a short broomstick.
It is a short broomstick for somebody who's a full 6 feet tall.
Boom.
There you go. But that's gonna give you a little bit of an external cue as to what your trunk position looks like when hinging, right? So that hinge in itself can be a really valuable tool, and I think is probably the biggest thing that I would pick out here. Now, hinging properly is gonna allow you to brace better, and it's gonna probably allow you to hit depth a lot more comfortably, right? When we're in this really overextended position, we tend to run out of room at the bottom, and it feels like depth long before it is because we're so extended. And when we're a little more neutral range, you'll find you'll get better depth more comfortably, and you'll be better able to orient yourself coming out of the bottom. So in the reversal, after you change directions, you will be able to have better positioning, better power. Chances are your trunk and your legs will work better. You might not have as much of the sciatica stuff going on. A lot of that's gonna come from bracing and hinging properly. So hopefully you've enjoyed our little primer on that through here, and thanks to Dylan for demonstrating that. Hopefully that makes it in the video and you could actually see it. It's gonna be an awkward, blurry zoom.
Hopefully I'm not blocked by you. But
my mass.
Next up, I'm gonna assume this is Evgeny. I don't know how else I would pronounce it. This is a bench press, 185 kilos for 1 rep, RP 10.
Bench, all right.
He's in the 105 kilo weight class. This is a training PB. Main concern is that leg drive lacks stability.
Leg drive lacks stability. Sorry, I might have put my water bottle in front of you while you were reading there, Dylan.
God damn it.
All right, so I think let's just watch I want to check out this re-rack, or this unrack, sorry, a little bit. So I think we could initially get a little tighter before we unrack the bar, right? Right now we're unracking with the heels up. Now, interesting distinction, I don't often recommend unracking with the heels up. I do recommend unracking with the butt up, but I think having the heels up makes it so that specifically what you're talking about, which is that kind of base of support in the foot position and the leg drive, is not gonna be as stable or as tight. And you can see here that actually after the bar is unracked, if we watch closely, we do get a little more adjustment from that lower body. Now, once we've unracked, we should be pretty much set everywhere that isn't your shoulder girdle, right? This whole system here should be completely set. The next thing I'm seeing here is that we maybe aren't as tight as we can be in this upper back, right? One of the things that I often recommend is gonna be to pull this bar out just a tiny bit more. It's gonna force your shoulder blades to kind of track underneath it, and that sort of feel of doing a quick little bit of straight arm pull down is gonna help really drive that chest up and create a lot more stability here, because we can see you're pretty shaky out of the rack, right? So I'm looking for different ways to approach that and try to get more stability before we start the descent. Because if we start the descent and we're unstable, like this thing's on a free ride kind of on the way down. The touch is, right, we touch and then we sink and then we try to drive it up. So I think the touch is pretty unstable. I think regardless of whether or not you are going to be somebody who touches a little heavier, or if you want to, play around with a bit of a lighter touch, I'm not going to tell you which one's going to be better competitively or allow you to bench the most weight, but what I will tell you is that working with some lighter touches and some more controlled touches, even just as a secondary or as an accessory, developmental, whatever you want to call it, as an accessory movement, is going to help you build a lot more stability on the chest, which is something I think that this bench press needs a lot. We're pretty quick on the way down. Like I said, we touch, we get this like little bit of pause, and then it kind of sinks more, and then we're pressing it up. So if I were refereeing this in a competition, I would be blue lighting, I think, for that sort of extra sink after the press command, right? I also, if I was a head ref, probably wouldn't have given you the press command there yet, because again, that bar needs to be motionless on the chest, right? And unless I pause it, we're not seeing motionlessness on the chest. We're seeing a touch, a sink, and then it's firing up. The other thing I think is maybe your head is coming up on the way down, which again tells me we're losing this chest height, right? So when I was talking about pulling the bar out of the rack and that helping to drive the chest up, we don't want to be losing that on the way down. Now, we didn't lose it as much as maybe I thought. You do a decent job keeping the chest up. Obviously flatten it out a little bit because the bar impacts you and kind of presses down a little, but you can see there on the way up, we're also losing a lot of shoulder position, right? This shoulder kind of comes way out here. We end up with the bar a little crooked, and then we're having to kind of really work on getting our shoulder blades back onto the bar and getting the bar locked out those last couple inches, which often comes from that shoulder position. So I think it's a little bit less about your leg drive and a little more about controlling the bar on the chest specifically, as well as maybe playing with a little more of a sort of constant tension as opposed to that bar coming down really quickly and then sinking and kind of heaving it up, right? So there's probably somewhere in that Goldilocks range where we have a little bit more control, a little bit of a lighter touch, and I think that would help quite a bit in terms of your overall stability, your consistency, your ability to pause and have good clean reps that adhere to the rules of powerlifting. So, hope that helps.
Hope that helps, Evgeny. Next up, we've got Tim. This is a 170 for 3 deadlift. I'm assuming kilos.
Yeah.
He had a comp 2 months ago, but ever since the comp, his deadlifts have just been feeling horrible. He tried conventional for a block, couldn't manage it, and went back to sumo. Now sumo just isn't clicking, especially with the lockout. It feels too hard for a weight that used to be so easy. Any tips on how to improve lockout?
Yes. So this is a really good illustration of some of the stuff I was talking about with that first lifter, Andrew. But when we lose position here, that makes the lockout tricky, right? So you actually do a pretty good job getting into position, and I wouldn't say that it's a position issue. I'd say it's a maintenance of position issue. So we're getting into a good position, but we're not maintaining it because I think we're working really hard to try to pull back off the floor. Maybe our brace isn't as tight as it could be. We're not getting enough sort of depression force or like lats contributing to the brace. And I think the big thing that we're seeing here is because we're losing that position, it's making the lockout really tricky. So at this point, I think, this will be my conjecture, which I guess is what this whole show is all about. But it looks to me like we're trying to pull back more as opposed to staying over the bar and keeping this torso position consistent, which is what I would recommend, right? Try to keep that torso position as consistent as possible off the floor. The other thing we're getting is this shifting forwards from the hips and lower body, which tells me that overall we might need to actually set up a little more over the bar. We might be trying to set up behind the bar, which is causing us to end up losing a fair bit of position on the way up and then having to go through a lot of that sort of low back extension at lockout, right? We also, it looks like we're seeing the knees lock really early. And while I do often advocate for an early knee lock, I think that helps people get a lot of priority on the quads and on that push off the floor. I think that you might be kind of over exaggerating that. And lastly, if through this part of the movement, once the knees have kind of locked, if you're still thinking about a lot of external rotation and outward pressure, lateral pressure, pushing the knees out, that kind of stuff, get rid of that, right? Because those two things, the hips extending and being overly rotated, are actually somewhat mutually exclusive. So if you're just standing, and again, I'm gonna give a poor demonstration of this, but if you're thinking about rotating outwards at the knees, nobody can see my lower body, I don't know how effective this is gonna be, but if you're thinking about pushing your knees out while trying to extend, it's gonna be really hard to actually get extension. So if that's something that you're cueing or focusing on a lot at the top, just let those knees come in as you go to lockout, right? As the knees start to lock, just let them kind of come in so that you can get better and more effective hip extension through the lockout. It looks like we've got a different angle here. Yeah, it's not egregious, you know, like I think this is definitely a position that a lot of lifters can get a pretty good solid lockout from. So I think, you know, we could work on maybe loosening the belt, playing with some beltless stuff to really feel out your position. Who knows, beltless like competition deadlifts might be better for you. You know, that's definitely the case for some people. I would also play with some pause deadlifts so that when we start the pull in this position, we pull to there and then pause and ensure that we're not losing position, that the positioning in the low back specifically and the mid back is not changing as we break the bar off the floor, because that's the biggest thing I'm seeing here. And lastly, train that back. Get some back extensions in there. Get some heavy rows in there, bent over barbell rows, pendulum rows, chest supported rows. Do some heavy rowing, and that's really gonna help you build your back. Because the other thing, my final kind of, you know, theoretical scenario here, is that you're just gonna be a lifter who has a little bit of back extension in their sumo. It's not a bad thing. It's not unheard of. A lot of very successful sumo deadlifters have that little bit of extension, or sorry, flexion in their lift. If you're strong enough to overcome it at the top and you can bring that back strength up, then your lockout's gonna get better and it's gonna make more sense.
It'll just make more sense. You heard it here, folks.
Yeah, if your lifts make more sense, then you'll make more lifts.
Next up, this is our last submission of the day. This is Francis. It's a 275 squat for 4 reps. Failed last rep, max out session.
All right.
It feels like he's been stuck on this weight forever. He's been running Johnny Candido's 16-week periodized program for about 6 months. He made steady gains for the first 3 programs, but now I feel like he's plateaued on every lift. Francis wants to hit 315 on squat without a belt before he buys one. Has been bulking during this period, which he knows can change leverages. Francis says, I know I go really low when I squat, but I do it so I never have to question depth. I also think I might have a bit more of a butt wink. Hope you can help with things I'm not seeing in my technique.
All right. So, as is tradition with the final lift to form check Friday, we're leaving it up to you, the viewer. That is until next week, when we will start our episode with Francis's squat. So head on into the comments below. Let us know what you think. If there are some things that Francis can clean up here, and then I will chime in next week. He will be the first lift that we will look at, and I will give my thoughts on that. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. If you like this content, make sure to check out our live stream on YouTube and Twitch. And yeah, submission details below. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye.